The National Capital Region, which includes the city of Ottawa, remains unceded Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory.
Alice's impressive body of significant documentary films explore stories as varied as that of Marianne Shadd and the Duke of Boers of Saskatchewan. Allison's film Fettercairn World War I on Indian Lake garnered immense praise from many, including the late Tim Cook. Allison's talent and versatility are abundantly evident in the insightful films she created for the Township of Rideau Lakes, and now for us, performing as researcher, scriptwriter, videographer, narrator, and editor. Beyond her acclaimed work as a documentary filmmaker, Allison is recognized for her ongoing contributions to historical research and heritage preservation, her support in Rideau Lakes Township, as well as here as a member of the Board of Heritage Ottawa. Repeatedly, through our history, American leaders have looked with aggressive tones towards Canada. But that's the nice thing about history. It's in the past, right? That sort of thing could never happen today. Allison Margot Smith takes us back today to when indeed we had grave concerns that the USA wanted to make us the 19th state.
Hi everybody, and thank you. I'm not going to say very much right now. The film basically stands on its own. The Rideau Canal of today forms an idyllic recreational waterway, passing through historic cities, towns and villages, farmland, wilderness, and cottage country. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the region is explored as a place for British loyalists to resettle after the American Revolution. Later, it is surveyed as a route for a military canal. The canal is to transport troops and supplies between Montreal and the Great Lakes, and to bypass the exposed stretch of American border along the St. Lawrence River. This canal is to transit a wilderness region with no rail and few roads. And in the 18th and early 19th centuries, such roads as do exist are exceedingly rough. After the loss of the Revolutionary War with the Americans, the British need to settle retreating loyalists. This situation leads to the first survey of the Rideau Corridor in 1783. The survey is carried out by Lieutenant Gershom French, assistant engineer with the Corps of Loyal Rangers. Along with an Indigenous guide, 2 members of the Provincial Corps of the British Army, and 2 French Canadians, the party travels by canoe up the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, making notes about the quality of the land for farming. They portage across the isthmus at today's Newborough and paddle a route similar to today's canal system to Jones Falls Rapids. But south of the rapids, these early surveyors follow what is, at the time, the more obvious route. This 1783 route goes down the Whitefish River, through what are now the hamlet of Morton and Lower Beverly Lake, and on down the Gananoque River to the St. Lawrence. 12 years later, in 1795, another similar survey is carried out by Lewis Grant, a provincial surveyor. Grant's survey follows a similar route to that of Lieutenant French, but with two differences. Grant begins his survey at the St. Lawrence River and travels north up the Gananoque River. As well, Grant himself only personally travels as far as Sand Lake, between today's Jones Falls Locks and Davis Lock. But Grant includes notes from Indigenous sources about the lakes and portages up to the isthmus at Newborough and on into the Rideau Lakes and river. But in the early 19th century, significant localized geographic changes occur, changes which alter the flow of water in the wilderness of the Gananoque and Cataraqui watersheds. Early settler Lemuel Haskins constructs dams that divert waters that originally flowed from Jones Falls Rapids down the Whitefish and Gananoque rivers. He builds two dams to create mill ponds to supply water to his mills. One dam is in the Gananoque watershed, and the other is in the Cataraqui watershed. Together, the waters in these mill ponds back up behind the dams and flood into the Cranberry Marsh. This marsh is marked on Lewis Grant's 1795 map as impassable in summer. This new floodwater, however, creates drowned lands. The dams and flooding divert some of the water flow away from the Gananoque watershed and into the Cataraqui watershed. These early industrial changes to the courses of local waterways lead surveyors in the 1800s to choose the Cataraqui River and its watershed as the most obvious route for a canal to Kingston and Lake Ontario. In 1812, war with the Americans reignites. By the fall of 1814, after 3 years of war, a British Lieutenant Colonel, George MacDonald, discovers some disturbing plans by the Americans. Colonel MacDonald confirms by way of spies operating in the U.S. that the Americans are planning to cut off the British supply route along the St. Lawrence River. This route is a critical artery that for 3 years has supported the British war effort on Lake Ontario and also on Lake Erie. MacDonald, known as Red George for the color of his hair, has also been studying the possibility of building a military canal. He wants to bypass the vulnerable section of the St. Lawrence River running from Kingston to Montreal. In 1814, MacDonald proposes a route that goes up the Ottawa River from Montreal to the then village of Wrightstown, across from what soon becomes Bytown and later Ottawa. His proposed route then travels up the Rideau River and into the Rideau Lakes. MacDonald proposes a series of temporary dams and canals to allow supplies to reach the Gananoque and Cataraqui watersheds down to Kingston. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald sends all his findings and proposals to his commanding officer, Governor-in-Chief of the Canadas, Sir George Prevost. Prevost immediately begins to act on these proposals, but before anything significant can take place, the Treaty of Ghent is signed on December the 24th, 1814, ending the war. However, in British North America and in London, anxieties continue to run high that the Americans are not truly finished. These anxieties are well-founded. 3 years later, the Americans are busy building 2 military roads from the south into the St. Lawrence River Valley. Moreover, by 1825, the young American nation has completed the Erie Canal, connecting Lake Erie and Lake Ontario to the Hudson River. If the St. Lawrence River was ever blocked, the Americans could use the new Erie Canal to transport their own supplies and troops between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes without depending on the St. Lawrence River. Meanwhile, on the British-Canadian side of the border in 1816, yet another survey is completed for the military, this time by Royal Engineer Lieutenant Joshua Jebb. Jebb's survey examines a route that, like McDonald's, travels up the Rideau River. But Jebb is specifically instructed to survey Irish Creek, which flows into the Rideau River below Smith's Falls. Jebb's Irish Creek route bypasses the rest of the upper Rideau River and lakes entirely. This Irish Creek route then travels down to Lake Ontario and Kingston by way of the now dammed Upper Gananoque and Cataraqui watersheds. In Jebb's expert opinion, there is insufficient water to support a viable canal at the summit between the Rideau and the Gananoque watersheds. Instead, Jebb proposes a railway of 8 kilometers to transport cargo over this summit. Still other potential canal routes are also explored. In 1822, 2 additional surveys are carried out, beginning on Lake Ontario. One surveys a route between Belleville and Pembroke. Another starts at Kingston, reaching the Ottawa River at Hawkesbury. A year later, in 1823, the province of Upper Canada sends civil engineer Samuel Close to examine the various proposed routes. Close dismisses the Irish Creek route, citing an inadequate water volume to operate this route unless a 16-kilometer canal is dug to obtain water from Rideau Lake. As well, he discovers that the summit to be crossed on the Irish Creek route is higher than the summit on the Rideau-Newborough Isthmus route. Accordingly, Close returns to the route originally proposed in 1814 by Red George MacDonald. This proposed route would follow the Rideau River and Rideau Lakes and cross the summit at the Newborough Isthmus. His proposal includes 40 kilometers of excavated canals, 50 locks, and numerous dams. It is notable for its very low cost estimate. This estimate will come back to haunt Lieutenant Colonel John By, who is ultimately tasked with building the canal for this unrealistically low price. Close later confesses that the low price was intended to be an incentive for the authorities to expedite the project. In any event, in 1825, Close's proposal is confirmed by a joint provincial commission representing the Upper and Lower Canadas. As well, his proposal is endorsed by a commission of Royal Engineers who further recommend lock dimensions that will coincide with those of other Montreal and Ottawa River canal locks. With the results of these 2 commissions, the project is finally approved by British Parliament and can, at long last, move forward. Colonel By arrives in Quebec in the spring of 1826. He spends the first few months reviewing all available information pertaining to the project. He travels to Wrightstown in September and moves immediately to choose the best site for the first set of locks. These flight locks will climb out of the Ottawa River, around the Rideau Falls, and into the Rideau River. Rather than trying to build these locks directly from the foot of the Rideau Falls, Colonel By chooses a spot slightly further upstream on the Ottawa River at Slay Bay. This starting point for the Rideau Canal comes to be known as Entrance Valley. There, Colonel By establishes his first camp, which quickly acquires the name Bytown. The intent is to build a straightforward, slackwater military canal system that connects existing navigable rivers and lakes. It is to be 202 kilometers long, of which only 32 kilometers will be new channels. Unlike most British canals of the time, it will have no towpaths, but will rely on transiting boats and ships to provide their own means of locomotion. It is to be straightforward, but the reality is quite different. This project has a complexity that has never before been attempted, and it is the single largest capital works project in the history of the British Empire at the time. The resulting canal system is a slackwater design, and it does connect existing lakes and rivers. But the required locks, weirs, dams, and spillways, along with numerous bridges and the new town site of Bytown, are entirely beyond anyone's wildest expectations.
So thank you all for coming out and having a look at the film. I think it's just really exciting in 2026 to be able to look back on the events that took place 200 years ago and to think about how they led to the creation of our beautiful city. This image here that you see on the slide is was drawn and painted by Lieutenant Colonel John By in 1826. And it's showing the first camp for his crew as they prepared to build the Rideau Canal. So, it's just kind of amazing to have a picture that's so precisely on point for this film and for remembering the beginnings of Bytown. When you make a historical documentary film, it's often a challenge to find images showing the subject of your film. Frequently, you need to use images that are close to, but not exactly on point. But this image by Colonel By could not be more precisely on point. It's the right place, it's the right date, and it's even the right artist. For this film, as well as for some of my previous films, I have been particularly lucky to have Thomas Burroughs' watercolors, some of which we saw in the film today. The one here was also painted in 1826, and is of the Rideau Falls. Thomas Burroughs worked with Colonel By on the building of the Rideau Canal, and he created many of these small paintings in the 1820s and 1830s, although for some, he didn't add the color till many years later. And it's notable that Thomas Burroughs was not actually a technically qualified military artist. He was a sort of hobby artist, but I think his paintings are really quite amazing. And his real job was actually working on the building of the canal, not as a laborer, but as a actually, I'm not even sure what his role was, and I think it changed. It was more of a managerial role. Okay, so next picture, please. So this is one of Bytown that he painted in 1845, so 13 years after the canal opened. And you can see that what was previously a campsite is now quite a significant town center with some significant structures, including the bridge and the locks. But for this film, as well, this one of Bytown he painted in 1845, but some of his paintings illustrate the actual building of the canal. So according to Burroughs' notes that accompanied the picture, this is a picture of the dam at Jones Falls, and when it was nearing completion. So some of his images were actually to do with the construction, and this would be an example of one of them. So these sorts of images are so on point for accompanying a historical documentary film. Imagine if I'd been able to go back in time, and if I'd been able to go out with my camera and take photographs of the building of the Rideau Canal, specifically for this film. These Burroughs images are a bit like that. They capture a point in time in our history. The Burroughs collection actually disappeared after Burroughs' death, and thankfully it was later rediscovered in 1907 in the attic of his daughter's home in Detroit. Yeah, and fortunately was donated by Burroughs' grandson, whose name was A.H.D. Ross, to the Archives of Ontario in 1948. And in fact, if you want to see more of Burroughs' paintings and know more about his life, the Archives of Ontario have produced a really excellent online website that that details things about his life and about like his private life and his painting, and so it's quite comprehensive. This image here shows the cut over the height of land at Newborough Lock. They are some of the most beautiful period illustrations of the region in existence. And for the purposes of my film about the Rideau River and Canal, they provide truly exquisite images to accompany the narrative. For historical documentary films, archival images and archival film footage can offer a kind of proof that what the film narrative says really happened. After all, a documentary film is not like an academic paper. They don't have citations, they don't give sources for our research. There's no superscript numbers pointing to footnotes, and they don't offer that kind of proof. So there's no reassurance that something you say is founded in accepted thinking or recognized academic work. But I would argue that archival images or archival video can act as a kind of citation. The idea of an image as a citation works if it demonstrates something that the film script asserts, if it comes from the period that the film addresses, and if it comes from the place that the film is about. These Thomas Burroughs images offer excellent citations for my film, since they show that he actually bore witness to the events that I described.
The same is true of the first image that I showed you by Colonel By. But this doesn't always work. Images are not always able to act as these sort of citations. For example, some subjects have few images. Some underrepresented communities don't have images in the archives. Many people didn't have the financial ability to have their lives documented in images. And some people actively chose to keep their lives hidden. I've made 2 films about Black history in Canada, and I can attest to the fact that some of these folk left very few images by which to recollect them. One of these films was about an enslaved woman who originally came to Montreal in the 1730s. The only surviving images related to her are the trial transcripts for the court case against her. And I just as an aside, I have to say, looking at an image like this that's handwritten with this lovely script and, you know, with her name in the second line, it's really quite just thrilling to see that sort of an image reflecting her life. The only surviving images related to her are the trial transcripts, and she was tried for burning down Montreal, and she was found guilty and executed. Her name was Marie Joseph Angelique, but this is not an archival image. This is a new image that I had made for the film, since there are actually no images by which to remember her. The other film is about an African-American abolitionist who came to Canada in the 1850s and lived in Chatham, Ontario for 13 years. Her name is Mary Ann Shadd Carey. And even though she was a free woman and comparatively well-to-do and well-educated, this is the only archival image of her in existence. But this image of Mary Ann Shadd attests to her existence, and from it we know what she looked like, which is huge. As well, this one and only photograph of this famous American has ended up in the library and archives in Canada. And so this photograph is thought to have been taken during her time in Canada. So it, along with lots of other information, reinforces the understanding of her life in Canada. In other words, this image tends to act like a citation in that it is an artifact that attests to the life of Mary Ann Shadd in Canada. But there are not always images available to act like a citation. Instead, we must use images that are less precisely on point. For example, we might choose an archival image from a different place to represent the subject matter place, if it's not too well known. But you have to be really careful with this because there are experts everywhere who might recognize the place or recognize the image and be confused by this imposter image. I love this image at showing the chaos of mid-19th century taverns, and I used it in a film about taverns in Upper Canada. But it's actually by a French painter, and is probably actually a scene in France. And coming back to Marie-Joseph Angelique, sometimes the only option for a historical documentary filmmaker is to create a new image or use new video. This image here is an example by an Halifax artist named Teresa Fenton. Filmmakers also use other methods. They create reenactments, and anybody who's seen any of the Ken Burns films knows about reenactments. They're expensive, so I don't do them. We make animations and we make maps, or we make new animated maps, such as the ones that you saw in the film today, which I created myself using Google Maps and PowerPoint.
These are all options for use when making a historical documentary film. One might also use an archival image that has been edited. This image here is of an 1837 political meeting in what is now Ontario. It was actually drawn decades later as an illustration. I used it in a film about 1830s Upper Canada election riots. But the names on the placards were wrong for my purposes, so I edited them out. So I want you to watch carefully. If you look at that image and you look at the placards, it says Bidwell. And just watch that. So now it doesn't say Bidwell. And that's the image that I use. And it's not a deception, it's rather avoiding confusion. In other words, it's imagery that is purposely made to illustrate a point. But if we accept the need for new images or new video to illustrate a historical film, can we also accept the idea of creating new images using artificial intelligence? With the emergence of AI-generated films, questions have been raised recently about whether we can any longer trust a documentary film. I would argue that using AI to create new images is really no different than using any other artistic tool. Even using a regular camera, we frame our subject matter to include some content and exclude other content. And even archival images, such as those by Thomas Burroughs, which seem like perfect period pieces, period illustrations, might to some degree be composed. Burroughs might have left out of his composition things he felt were unappealing or distracting. Burroughs might have, and I think when using AI, it's about one's intent and whether one is trying to deceive. For my own filmmaking, I've used AI to generate 2 images, and both were made to look like early 20th century black and white photographs. But my intent was not to deceive, but rather to create images that blend with the archival images in my film. So this one was an action image of kids swimming and splashing in the water. And in the early 20th century, which was the time period of my film, action photography was just emerging. And so there are not very many good ones around to choose from. And so I had to resort to using an artificial intelligence generated image. And this one was a nighttime image, and for the same film, of lamps that were placed on the ends of docks in cottage country to help guide boaters home after dark. Again, in early 20th century, there were few nighttime images, and so I had to resort to artificial intelligence, and it was useful in both cases. Not perfect. I had to edit this one actually because it came out kind of wrong, but in any case, it was helpful as a starting point. In both cases, I had good sources indicating that the 2 things that I was asserting in the narrative had actually happened. But neither of these 2 AI-generated images provide proof, and therefore cannot act as citations. As an aside, I want to reassure you that when I write a film script, I do the best research that I can, and I include traditional citations and a full bibliography in the text of the script. But I want to mention one more type of image. When a film is describing a societal perspective or a social movement, it is often hard to find archival images that reflect that idea. And I've come to find that a good source of images for social commentary can be found in cartoons. This one from 1870 speaks to the temperance movement and actually comes from a series of 6 cartoons on the subject. These cartoons offer decent proof, like a citation, confirming that the issue being discussed in the film was actually happening at the time. So you might ask the question, is an image a perfect citation? And I would say no. But even offering a written citation in an academic paper is just pointing to the academic work of another researcher, albeit perhaps a specialist or an expert. But even academic work falls out of favor at times, and sometimes over time, our academic ideas change. And often the academic community itself argues about the validity of a specific piece of research. So in effect, no citation is necessarily perfect proof about a claim about history. It's more like a kind of evidence which might or might not be entirely convincing. For the purposes of the planning and building of the Rideau Canal, there are a multitude of good sources and some fantastic color images, as you've seen here today. As a military project, there was a lot of documentation of plans and events, and including the surveys that I talked about, and then documentation about the execution of the plans. So for the film you saw today, I was not forced to edit images, and I wasn't forced to insert any AI-generated images either. And most of the archival images that I used for this film can, in fact, act as really good citations, attesting to the events described in the film. Thank you.
We're going to have an opportunity for some questions. I want to thank Allison so much for sharing her film and her presentation with us today. Very thought-provoking. You're talking about altering pictures makes me think of if I'm a mayor out for a jog and I see a scene, maybe I remove a derelict Christmas tree. It's interesting too, because in the last 3 months, we've had 3 posts on our Facebook that have generated lots of conversation about artificial intelligence. One was Andrew King, who had taken some of his own artwork and altered them with AI. Another was the work of our cameraman here, David, who took photographs from the 1916 parliamentary fire and animated them, just made them move for us. And our favorite James Powell recently had a post about the rifle associations that went to the militia in the 1800s. There wasn't a good picture. So it just generated a very simple AI-generated picture of a rifle, nice color and stuff. Drew lots of responses to our Facebook post. And each of these cases, in the comments, what an interesting conversation, respectful conversation for people sharing different points of view. So it's definitely a moving target for us.